how to solve this little problem, which is the train journey. So if you look at it, we're going to start with the exam question. So develop an algorithm that calculates the amount of fuel a train will need to complete a journey. Again, you could do this in pseudocode or a flowchart, it doesn't matter. Here I'm going to show you how to do it in pseudocode. And what we need to do first of all is to try and break this algorithm down into its input, processing and output sections. So let's have a look at this slowly. So I'm going to start off with the input section. So the algorithm must ask the user how many kilometers the journey will be. Now, it doesn't seem to ask for anything else afterwards. So let's highlight that and let's just put that in a dark blue. So that's our input section. It then says only continue if the user enters a value greater than 0. So this bit down here, that must be our output. So let's highlight that in a dark green, which leaves this section here as our input. And I'm going to put that into a dark red. So if you're doing this in the exam, you could highlight like this if you wanted to, if that makes it easier, okay, for you to identify the different parts of it. So what we're going to do over here is we're going to start to build this and see if we can work out how this algorithm fits together. And again, remembering that we don't need a huge amount of detail in it, we don't need anything pretty. First of all, we're going to ask the user how many kilometers the journey will be. So what we want to do is input journey kilometers. One little tip here, I've got a underscore between the word journey and the word km. Don't do this because otherwise that is two separate variables and you'll get marked down for it. So either keep them together or put a underline there. That's what I tend to do. And now we're straight into our processing section. I'm going to then pick up my red here. So only continue if the user enters a value greater than 0. So if journey km is greater than 0, then, and now a little tip for you, wherever you've got an if statement in pseudocode, this doesn't apply to Python, just pseudocode, you need to have an end if somewhere. So I'm going to park that down here. Now, another little tip for you is that the way the exam is marked is it's marked almost line by line. So even if you don't get the processing bit right, you can get marks for the input and the output. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to deal with the output here. And I know that sounds odd, but it's just going to maximize my marks. And what I'm going to do here is finally display the amount of fuel, so print fuel. So hopefully I've now got some points there already in the bag. So we can go back to our processing bit. And we've dealt with the first line now, the first bit of processing, only continue if the user enters a value greater than 0. Let's deal with the next one. Set the amount of fuel to a number 100 times greater than the number of kilometers. Well, that's quite straightforward to do. So we're going to pick up on this, and what I'm going to do is fuel becomes 100 times journey underscore km. Again, notice the back arrow which says take all of this and store it in this variable, this identifier. That means assign to or store in, depending on how you want to think about it. The other thing we need to do is to not allow the amount of fuel to be less than 1500. So if the fuel is less than 1500, then what we want to do is make sure that the fuel is set to 1500. So that makes sure that the fuel never dips below 1500. And what I've said before is that every time you've got an if statement, you need an end if. So I'm going to put it in here. I'm going to tidy it up a little bit, just bring that stuff back to here. And there's my algorithm all put together for you. Okay, so let's see if we can turn that into some actual Python. So here I am set up and ready to do my Python code. I've broken this down into input, process and output, but you'll also see I've added on an initialize section. To initialize in a computer program means to set the variables to a default value. So if you think about computer games, a initialize might set the number of lives to 3 or set your health to 100. Depends what you want. So let's see if we can put this together a little bit. So initialize, well, what have I got here? I've got a variable called journey km and I've got a variable called fuel. So this is sort of optional, but it's really good programming practice. So journey km, I'm going to set that to 0. And I'm also going to set the fuel to 0. So this just sets up my variables, sets them to 0. It's not necessary in Python, but I'm going to do it anyway. And what you'll also see is that these variables, these two variables, are integers. So I'm going to have to deal with them as integers when I handle the data. So the first thing I need to do is get the journey kilometers in. So here we go. So what you should notice there is that I've got my journey in kilometers being read in. Remember, this side is assigned or saved in this side. And I'm converting it to an integer because I need to do some calculations with it. And if I don't convert it to an integer, it'll think it's a string. Be aware, as I've mentioned before, of your brackets, of your speech marks as well. Let's do the processing section. So let's do the if section. So here I'm going to start with the if section. So if journey km is greater than 0, I don't have a then in Python, but I do have a colon, which acts as the same thing. I don't have an end if either, so we've just got to be a bit aware of that. So fuel becomes 100 times journey km. I now need to deal with a situation where the fuel is less than 1500. So if fuel is less than 1500, again here's my colon, fuel is set to 1500. Now we don't have end ifs here, but if you want to imagine where they are, first one of them will be here. So that one belongs to the fuel less than 1500 one. And the other one will be here, and this one belongs to the first if statement, if journey kilometer is greater than 100. So I'm just going to put that in there. It's not necessary, it doesn't do anything for the program itself, but it just gives you an idea about what's happening. I'm just going to do the output section. There we go, don't forget the bracket. If you do forget the bracket, then quite often what happens is that you'll see the line being highlighted. I'm using a program called Thonny, which is freely downloadable. And it's just an alternative to idle. They're slightly easier to handle. Close that off. And I'm going to save that. And now we're ready to test it. Okay, so I'm ready to run the program, see what happens. So, it asks me for the journey in kilometers. Well, what should happen is it shouldn't do anything if I print out or go for -10. Well, that's not quite working, is it? So that seems to be a bit funny. That's that your fuel is 0. Well, it shouldn't be doing that. It shouldn't be allowing us to continue, so that's not quite working right. Let's just see if it works with some normal values. Let's try it with for 1300. Okay, that seems to be working. Let's try it with 10. And because 10 times 100 then ends up with 1,000, you end up with 1,500. So that's working. So the bit that's not working is this bit here. So let's have a look at the code and see what we can figure out. Okay, so what it says in the original instructions, and I'm just going to bring these in, is that you should only continue if the user enters a value of 0. Well, that actually applies to all of this. So all of this actually only happens when you have managed to enter a value greater than 0. So actually, not only is there a problem in our code, but there's a problem going right back to our original pseudocode. So let's see if we can fix the pseudocode first. Only continue if the user enters a value greater than 0. So actually, I only wanted to carry on if it enters a value of 0. So I'm going to take the if statement and break it apart a little bit, and in the middle of it, I'm going to put print fuel. So now it's not going to do anything unless journey kilometre is greater than 0. So what you've got is you've got input, you've got a process, but as part of that process you've got a little bit of output going on. So let's see if we can take that and do something with that to our code. So that's quite an easy fix maybe. Let's take that whole output section, and where we need to put it is just here. And it might need a little bit of playing around with, but hopefully that will do the job. So notice I've had to tab it in just to make it fit with that if statement. Let's try that now and see what we get. So I'm just going to move it up a little bit so you can see. So minus 10, it's not doing anything. Brilliant. Let's see what happens if we give it 0. And that's not doing anything either. So that's us correcting it a little bit and finding an error in the original algorithm, which leads us to an error in the program and then correcting that. So hopefully you can see that process from beginning through to end. So let's just reiterate a little bit about what we've done. We started off with an algorithm, this one here. We broke it down into input, process, and output. We developed our algorithm, but we had a bit of a problem that I introduced into the algorithm where I put the if statement here. When I put the print statement here, we shouldn't have done. So we corrected that eventually. And what we actually managed to do in the end was get the program working as we needed it to do, correcting it as we went along, trying to sort out some of the logic errors that were in there.